everybody. I'm Dawn Houghton. I work occasionally at the King's English Bookshop. And first thing I need to ask is that everyone turn off their cell phones. I am very lucky to introduce Kevin tonight. I've known him for 17 years. I met him at a writers group that Barry Scholl, who's in the audience tonight, assembled. And it was one of sort of those cute meet situations that you see in movies where one person goes up to another and they express, while they're talking at a gathering, they talk about their admiration for a piece of writing. So I was talking about this short story that I had read recently in Utah, in an old Utah holiday magazine. It was called Chitter. And Barry said, Kevin wrote that story. And Kevin shyly acknowledged that he had written this story about a man at his bachelor's party at a Little America suite. And sort of a Dorothy Parker-esque, John Updike-esque story. And I actually listened to on what is the KRCL podcast the other day, and it holds up wonderful. It didn't take me long to feel connected to Kevin, and I can't convey how much he's influenced me. In fact, some of my favorite writers I was introduced to by Kevin, Pauline Kael, Raymond Carver. He steered me towards the best music, the best film, the best television. His knowledge of pop culture is encyclopedic. I am proud of his accomplishments, though I never doubted he would arrive at this point. He is a man destined to find critical success. He's a generous reader with an incredible work ethic, a winning disposition, and prose that is clean and lyrical and evocative. He is also one of the finest editors I've ever known. Kevin is a native son, but he lives in Brooklyn now and has for the past 7 years with his wife Deborah and stepdaughter Laura. His work has appeared in places ranging from Salt Lake Magazine to Penthouse. In his spare time, he runs Mere Words Media, a public relations agency. His 2 books were published at nearly the same time by 2 different publishers and have both received much attention. Conversations with Clint, Paul Nelson's Lost Interviews with Clint Eastwood, circa 1979 to 83, has received acclaim in such notable places as the Wall Street Journal, the Hollywood Reporter, and the New Yorker Online, as well as by the director Peter Bogdanovich and many others. Everything is an afterthought. The life and writings of Paul Nelson has been praised in Salon, Vanity Fair, the Chicago Sun-Times, Rolling Stone, Men's Health, and the New York Times Sunday Book Review. NPR's Ken Tucker included it in his top 10 year in music. And Ken Tucker's list is just usually albums. He made a notable exception and said, I need to mention this book, Everything is an Afterthought. And the Library Journal named Everything is an Afterthought among the best books of 2011. Please welcome home my dear friend, Kevin Rupert.
First of all, thank you everyone for coming. Give everybody a chance to come in. I'd also like to thank, in addition to Don, Ann and Jenny at King's English and Mona. I appreciate it. And if you'd all do me a favor tonight before you leave, please buy a book. It doesn't have to be my book, but buy a book. Because King's English remains one of my favorite bookstores. And I just want you guys to do well. So, for those of you who don't know, Paul Nelson is one of the guys who invented what we know today as rock journalism, rock and roll journalism. In a nutshell, he went to University of Minnesota with Bob Dylan. While at Mercury Records as an A&R man in the early 70s, he signed the New York Dolls to their very first recording contract, and he was one of the last great editors at Rolling Stone magazine. Tonight I'm going to read from Everything is an Afterthought, the beginning of the book, which The book is actually divided into two books. The first book is Paul's biography. The second book is Paul's writing. And this is the beginning of the biography. Born January 21st, 1936, in the Red River Valley corner of Minnesota, Paul Clifford Nelson grew fond of telling people, "It was 45 below the day I was born. I thought the whole world might be 45 below. Who knew?" Clara and Clifford Nelson, his Warren-born and raised second-generation Swedish immigrant parents, had married 5 months before. Paul's presence at the wedding was never openly discussed. Clifford, who was almost 12 years older than Clara, was a savvy and successful businessman who quickly had gone from pumping gas to operating the whole service station. He'd lost almost everything in the stock market crash, then gained it all back. A couple of years before Paul was born, Clifford, with his brother Eddie and sister Hilda, took over the local Ford Mercury dealership and built it into one of Minnesota's largest agencies. Warren, a community with a slowly dwindling population of about 1,500 citizens, mostly of Swedish and Norwegian descent, was largely rural. Clifford also acquired a J.I. Case franchise selling farming equipment and owned a 2,000-acre farm of his own where the hired help raised mostly wheat and barley. The Nelsons lived in town. Warren, where the major landmark was the drugstore, had no record stores or bookstores, and until the addition of a drive-in years later, only one movie theater. Young Paul's introduction to cinema, which was against the family's evangelical mission covenant religion, came when his father took him to see Paul Muni in Commando Strike at Dawn. My mother was more religious than my father, Paul remembered. She frowned on movies as being evil. She also frowned on dances, playing cards, and drinking. In time, she would frown on Paul's girlfriend, Roberta, who was Catholic. But Clara was stricter than Clifford and had no problem telling Paul what to do. Linda Nelson Barnett, Paul's younger sister by 9 years, says, "I think he did just what he wanted to do. My dad was more easygoing, always kind of quiet and smiley. He wouldn't say anything no matter what you did." It's okay. Though Paul appreciated the leeway, he would confide in Kenneth Miller in 1976, "I went through a time when I wasn't sure my father was actually my father. I had the idea that someone else in town was." Music played a part in young Paul's life. My aunt played piano. I remember hymns very fondly as the first music I heard. There were also a dozen or so 78s in the household. I couldn't read, but I would learn by the scratches on the label what they sounded like. Paul claimed that other than his father's subscriptions to Time and Newsweek, where Paul flipped directly to the book and movie reviews, the only reading matter at home was the Bible. He said that whenever he'd ask his parents for books or records for his birthday or Christmas, they'd almost always say, "Oh, don't you want a pair of socks or a shirt or something? Books are such a colossal waste of time." That was the prevalent attitude, so it was totally anti-anything to do with art. As it was, I think I bounced the other way by overreacting to that, probably. It pushed me towards art, as a form of rebellion, I suppose. Even in school, I always read all the stuff that wasn't on the reading list. Something in me just won't let me read what was required. It never became fun until I could do it without an A or as a goal, or a pass as a goal. I didn't start reading seriously till I was out of school. I could read what I wanted to, not what I was supposed to. Reading Nathaniel West and Graham Greene and seeing those, quote, sentences so perfect, unquote, made him want to try his own hand at writing. The first good book I read was The Third Man, and it wasn't even really that good of a book. I simply read it because I'd seen the movie. I remember that I had to order that book from 300 miles away to get it. It was a whole production number and quite a thrill when it came in the mail. You didn't have to depend on what paperbacks just happened to turn up at your drugstore, which wasn't much, or the 30 or 40 books in the town library. Actually, the corner drugstore was a better library. Paul boasted of having read every book in the Warren Public Library at least once to supplement the, quote, Reader's Digest abridged version of literature, unquote, that the Minnesota Department of Education had provided him. Paul also sent a way forward from Here to Eternity. The day after it arrived, he couldn't find the book when he came home from school. My mother had burned it up because she paged through it and found that there were dirty scenes in it, he told singer-songwriter Rod Stewart. I was so fucking mad. The only good teacher I had in high school was a journalism teacher. She was the whole experience. I learned more in that class than I did in anything else. Changed my life all the way around. Her name was Mary Lou Sullivan. I wanted to be a writer, not necessarily a journalist. I wrote short stories in high school and worked for the local paper. I covered sports events for the high school teams. Crap work. I never liked journalism per se. I wasn't surprised that I could do it. I never had any problem with it. In July of 1953, the War and Chief published what was probably Paul's first byline. In a column called Fair Chatter, he wrote, "Seems like the Marshall County Fair gets a little bigger, a little better, and a little different each year." Singer-songwriter Elliot Murphy says, he had an incredible collection of comic books. One day he came home from high school, and his mother had burned them all. He always told me, if I still had them today, I wouldn't have to work. It sounded like he never forgave her for that. I could just imagine, 16 years old or whatever. And I'm sure Paul didn't have an easy time with adolescence. And coming back home and his mother telling him that Jesus told her to burn all of his comic books. When he got old enough, Paul would borrow used cars from his dad's lot and drive to nearby Crookston and Thief River Falls, or across the border to Grand Forks, North Dakota, all of which were only 30 miles away. Farther away lay Winnipeg, where Paul liked to go for fish and chips. Canada was the only foreign country he ever visited. I always used to love it because you could look at English books there and English records, he said. About one of these jaunts, Paul wrote, "When I was 10 or 11, I was caught for stealing 2 singles in Grand Forks, North Dakota. Because I was a minor and it was my first offense, I was released into my father's custody. The experience was embarrassing and stupid, but in the end it was worth it. I got to keep the records. One was by Hank Williams as Luke the Drifter, the other was Chet Baker's My Funny Valentine." Jay Cox, "See, he just picks the best. Even if he's going to be put in the pokey, he still just picks the best." For Warren, television reception was no closer than 350-mile away Minneapolis, and Paul didn't see his first TV transmission in a department store window until he was 17 or 18. He said that everyone owned one, Michael Seidenberg says, but they just didn't broadcast there. Every night people would turn on the TV, waiting for some flicker of an image to finally get broadcast to where they lived. Nick Tosha says Bob Dylan got TV reception, Paul Nelson didn't. In 1954, Paul graduated second in his class and received a scholarship to St. Olaf, a small liberal arts college in Northfield, Minnesota. That summer, however, he boarded a Greyhound and headed east to New York. "I had about $100, period, for 2 weeks. I just stayed at the Y and walked around the city 24 hours a day, practically. I slept on 42nd Street sometimes, and in the all-night movies. It was wonderful. I just embraced culture like it was Marilyn Monroe." And I'm going to close this piece with an excerpt from an article Paul wrote about Chet Baker. "Maybe you had to have been there, but I've always felt that the 50s, that much maligned decade rightly chastised for its blandness, repression, and worse, was also paradoxically America's last golden era. Framed on one side by Depression communalism and post-World War optimism spiked with noir, and on the other by sensational 60s before they exploded into Apocalypse Now. The 50s tendered nearly everyone a humane lifestyle, complete with an undercurrent of dimly unaware, thwarted, and mostly unwanted innocence, i.e., something to rebel against, personally, socially, politically, whatever. From this potent brew came a strange band of vulnerable romantic icons whose solitary allure and smoky touch are still very much with us and will probably withstand time's every test. Larger than life, good, bad, trying to avoid one-namers from the country's heartland. Clifton Brando from Nebraska, Dean from Indiana, Elvis from Mississippi, Marilyn from sunny California, and on the cusp of the 60s, Dylan from Minnesota. I'm not sure that any other decade could have produced such intense introspection, sweet rebellion, and naive, confused cynicism, or such an air of utter aloneness." Thank you. Anybody have any questions? Or yes, sir.
I was just, I don't know exactly the age difference there, but I used to faithfully buy Rolling Stone from about 67 until about 75. I bought every issue. I look forward to buying every issue of that magazine. But sometime I was wondering if what was the last issue you bought before you realized it really stunk? Because it started stinking, I don't know when, 73 or 72? Do you remember that, the last issue you bought?
Yeah, it was in the actually early '80s for me, because Paul wrote up through '82, and after he stopped writing for the magazine, I just lost interest.
So you buying until he stopped writing?
Right.
Yeah, I've stopped long before. But I remember the name Paul Nelson.
Yeah, during the years you're talking about, he freelanced for Rolling Stone, and then it was from '78 through '82 he came in as an editor, and did some great pieces there for him, and championed punk rock, and basically drove Jan Wenner crazy. So.
Kevin, will you tell the story a little bit about how you came to write this book?
Yeah, sure. Like I said, I used to read Rolling Stone religiously, just as you did, as a teenager. And one of the writers whose work just really sang to me was Paul Nelson. There was just something about his language, and I would really enjoy going back and rereading those pieces. And I always just thought that somebody really ought to collect this work. And when Paul's work disappeared in 1982, I found myself left with all these back issues of Rolling Stone and Village Voice, and it just kind of stuck them away and kept them. And all through the years, I kept thinking about it. Somebody really should do this collection. When I moved to New York in 2005 to marry Deborah, one of the first things I did was I found out where Paul was working. For the last 15 years of his life, he worked as a clerk in a video store in the Village. And I wrote him a letter, and I suggested that we work together and anthologize some of his best work. And I never heard back from him. But in July of 2006, a good friend of his, Michael Seidenberg, called me and said, I don't know if you know, but Paul passed away a couple weeks ago. And I just wanted you to know he did receive your letter, and he was very touched by it. He was very touched that anybody remembered who he was. And he wanted to do the book with you, but he just really wasn't in any shape physically or mentally. And so I found out a few months later, when Paul's son Mark came to New York to collect his dad's belongings, Paul, in his last year, had terrible trouble with short-term memory and would write post-it notes to himself, even to the point of, I'm hungry, I need to eat. There were about a half dozen post-it notes with my name and phone number around the apartment. And if I ever had any doubt before, that, kind of sent me a signal that I should do this project. And the more I found out about Paul's personal life, which was just very compelling and tragic, that's when I realized that the book needed to be more than just an anthology. It needed to be his biography as well. Yes?
Okay, so you're both a fiction writer and non-fiction writer. Can you talk a little bit about, I don't know, the different hats that you wear and if you go into different modes as a writer?
No, the one thing that actually, before I did this book, the one thing I found was it was just much easier to write nonfiction using what I had learned about storytelling in fiction. And that's the same way I approached the biographical part of this book. It just, storytelling is storytelling.
So what did you learn about writing by looking at his life and the way he wrote?
Well, he never enjoyed writing. For him, it was really torture. He hated writing. He always, wished that he could get the same satisfaction from being a photographer, so that all he had to do was point and click. I don't know. I guess what I learned is, love what you're writing. I mean, for some time there, he was writing things that he wasn't enjoying the process. And to me, it's such a difficult thing to do. I mean, I don't go for this that writing is the hardest thing in the world to do. I mean, digging ditches is certainly a lot harder than writing. but I think you should enjoy it if you're going to put this much work into it, so much your passion into it. Yes.
You mentioned a little bit of how Paul's words kind of stood out to you. What was it, if you could kind of expound on that, what about his style was so significant to you, and how would you compare it to the state of rock journalism today?
Well, Paul's reviews used to average several thousand words, you know, and that was the kind of writer he was. If he could explain to you in 300 words why he loved Jackson Brown's The Pretender album, he would, but he couldn't. It would take him several thousand words, and that was the kind of record review section he ran at Rolling Stone. As far as what it was about his style, it struck me as kind of a mix between the hard-boiled detective fiction that was very clean prose and like F. Scott Fitzgerald. You know, it was just, it was kind of anachronistic in that way. You know, here's this guy who's writing like Fitzgerald, but he's writing about rock and roll. So.
And is there any vestige of that rock journalism today? Do you feel like it's kind of a dying art?
For that kind of writing, I think it's a dying art. But by the same token, I don't follow it that much these days. You know, there are certainly writers whose work I still admire, but you know, in too many cases, it really is just service copy. It's meant as a consumer guide, and you know, on the internet, there's some writing that, because you're not restricted by length, you can go on. But I don't know, just in terms of style and that, nobody leaps right to mind. I like Neil Strauss a lot. So. Okay.
Will you read more?
Well, I read more.
Yeah.
Want me to read more?
Yes.
I'll read some of the introduction to Conversations with Clint, and the introduction will actually kind of explain what the book is about. Begins with a quote. I'll say that you can see the man in his work just as clearly as you can see Hemingway in A Farewell to Arms or John Cheever in his short stories. Hell yes, he's an artist. I even think he's important. Not just a fabulous success at the box office, but important. Literary heavyweight Norman Mailer no doubt caused some eyebrows to skeptically rise when he penned these enthusiastic words in Parade magazine in 1983. But more than 11 years earlier in Rolling Stone, critic Paul Nelson had already come to the same conclusion. Reviewing Dirty Harry, he wrote that Eastwood, quote, promises to be a major force in the films of the next decade, both as an actor and a director, unquote. Screenwriter Jay Cox, then a critic for Time magazine and a good friend of Paul's, remembers that this was in the day of pre-Clint idolatry, when not too many people, especially critics, were prepared to come out and confess that they were Clint Eastwood fans. There were not a lot of us, John Morclin says. Not like today, Clint Eastwood had not really reached his pop critics of any kind. Paul was one of the few who really liked him. It took until 1979, but Paul finally convinced his editors at Rolling Stone that a cover story was in order. Paul, who was the magazine's record review editor, had a special arrangement with publisher Jan Wenner. In addition to his usual editorial duties, he would occasionally contribute feature stories, sprawling, sometimes award-winning pieces, about those artists whom he considered special. Even though he was a legendary as a music critic, movies were his first love. In the early 70s, he'd written a string of a half-dozen memorable film reviews for Rolling Stone. Friends with Eastwood, Jay Cox and his wife Verna Bloom provided Paul with his entree to the star. He either asked us or we volunteered, Cox says. Verna had been in 2 movies with Clint, so we called Clint. Not only did the actor-director say yes, but Paramount Pictures loved the idea and wanted to tie Paul's proposed piece to the studio's upcoming release, Escape from Alcatraz. Eastwood had starred in the film and was now lending a hand to the director, his old pal Don Siegel, with the editing. Paul could fly out to L.A. and snag some quotable Clintisms from him when he wasn't busy at the Moviola. But such flackery wasn't the kind of piece that Paul had in mind. I'm going to skip ahead here a little bit. Which is how, in October of 1979, Paul Nelson flew from the increasingly meaner streets of Manhattan to Boise, Idaho's Wild West, for arguably the most recognizable man in the world was making a movie called Bronco Billy. His first time on a set, he watched with a fan's fascination as Clint worked both sides of the camera. Back at the Red Lion Inn, where Eastwood and company had set up camp, Paul conducted lengthy, in-depth interviews not only with the lead, but with two of his co-stars, Clint's leading lady, personally and professionally Sandra Locke, and Sam Bottoms. By the time he returned to New York, Paul had plenty to write about. He and the star had hit it off. Unlike the laconic characters he was famous for portraying on screen, Eastwood with Paul was often loquacious, patiently answering questions he'd undoubtedly been asked dozens of times before, but was also confiding in him about subjects less frequently discussed. He spoke honestly about his influence and strengths, both as an actor and a director. He reminisced about his early days, trying to break through as a contract player, as well as his hopes for the future as a director. When Paul traveled to Los Angeles the next month to interview singer-songwriter Warren Zevon for another Rolling Stone cover story, Eastwood made time for him. And when Clint came to New York in December to shoot a few scenes for Bronco Billy, he invited Paul to his hotel room, and in between watching football on TV and drinking beer, Clint, not Paul, whose drink of choice was always Coca-Cola, and visiting with Jay Cox, they talked some more. What more could a journalist ask for? On top of it all, he liked his subject, and his subject, by all indications, liked him. Paul came away from the experience feeling, geez, Clint Eastwood is a real best friend type. As taken as he was with the band, though, when Bronco Billy opened for the first time, or opened the following June, its release was unheralded in Rolling Stone. Paul had failed to deliver his article. Fast forward a few months. Jay Cox received a call from Eastwood, who was already wrapping up work on Any Which Way You Can, one of Barry's favorite movies. The sequel to the immensely popular Every Which Way But Loose. 2 movies in 1 year was not unusual for Clint, who in earlier years had sometimes released 3. Someone at Rolling Stone had contacted him about sending someone, not Paul, out to interview him for the new film. A year had passed since the original round of interviews. What's up with the piece? If Paul was going to finish it, Clint wanted to go that route rather than start anew. Cox says, this was the first real sign I had that Paul was having serious problems. He reached out to him to find out what was going on. Paul assured Jay that he was indeed going to finish the article. In fact, it would be great if he could interview Eastwood some more about the new movie. The fire beneath him once again burning, in October Paul headed to Los Angeles where, in Eastwood's Malpaso company office on the Warner Brothers lot, another series of interviews commenced. By December, however, when Any Which Way You Can was released, 6 months after Bronco Billy, Paul still hadn't turned in the article. What happened after that, from the end of 1980 until early 1983, could be the subject for another book, and in fact is. Paul, falling victim to problems both personal and professional, struggled more and more with his writing. Even under the best of conditions, he was slave to his own obsessive-compulsive perfectionist tendencies. As his old friend Kit Rackless says, as a writer, he was a real diamond cutter kind of person. But this was something beyond his usual OCD-like inability to suffer a typographical error on the page, which had to be absolutely perfect before he could proceed. In the pre-PC and pre-word processing days of the 70s and 80s, Paul's only recourse was to rip the paper from the typewriter and start over on a clean sheet. This was writer's block in the bleakest sense, a paralysis that deadened not only his writing, but his entire being. The inability to arrange words on the page in ways that pleased him often rendered him horizontal and unable to function. By the time Paul quit his job at Rolling Stone in 1982, his colleagues had long stopped asking how the Eastwood piece was coming along. It was less awkward that way, for both parties. But the story didn't end in LA in